A quiet courtroom until one judge crosses the line, slapping a teenage black girl in front of everyone, thinking no one will hold him accountable. But he has no idea who she is, and even less idea who's on the other end of her message. Because she's not just a girl, she's the spark that ignites a national reckoning. What unfolds next is a powerful fight against silence, corruption, and generations of buried truth. And believe me, the moment she sends that text, everything changes. You won't want to miss what happens next. Let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. And while you're here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this need to be heard. The air inside the old community hall was thick with the scent of dust-worn wood and something faintly metallic like the breath of history still clinging to the rafters. Leona Harper stood near the back, one hand resting gently on the worn strap of her canvas book bag, the other tucked into her coat pocket, fingers curled into a quiet fist. The town hall meeting was already halfway through, filled with voices layered in frustration and the weary cadence of people too used to being ignored. The moderator's voice had just introduced the final question round when Leona's voice rose clear, even but not loud, as if she were speaking to reason itself and not just the panel at the front. Under the Fourth Amendment, she said, calmly, unjustified searches are illegal even if a community is poor. Our zip code doesn't strip us of our rights. Heads turned, some surprised, some skeptical. A few nodded slowly, the way older people do when something forgotten finally returns to memory. Judge Hollis Mercer, seated at the center of the dais in his dark, too-perfect suit, didn't nod. His eyes narrowed instead, not in thought but in challenge. "And you are," he asked, voice clipped, hands folded with the kind of stillness that demanded submission. Leona stepped forward, one breath deep in her chest, shoulders back, though her heartbeat stuttered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Leona Harper, sir," she said, "junior at Booker High. We studied constitutional law this semester with Miss Ellison." There was no tremble in her voice. Not yet. Just the firm grace of a girl who knew she was stepping into something far bigger than herself, but refused to back away. Mercer leaned forward slightly, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And I assume you're here to teach us something." His tone carried no real question, only warning, as if daring her to continue. Leona didn't flinch. "No, sir," she said, "just to ask why our police reports for stop and frisks don't follow the documentation protocol required by state law." For a second, the room went silent, not the peaceful kind, but the brittle pause before glass shatters. Mercer blinked once slowly. "Young lady," he said, his voice now dipped in something colder, "it is deeply inappropriate for you to come into this chamber and make baseless legal accusations." Leona's eyes met his steady. "I'm not making accusations. I'm asking for clarification. There's a difference." Someone in the back let out a breath too sharply, and it echoed just enough to make the moment feel larger than it already was. The judge sat back and his jaw flexed once, then again. Leona felt the weight of eyes on her, not just the judges, but the audience's, and more intensely, her own mother's gaze, from the far left aisle, stiff-backed in a brown coat, lips pressed thin. The air seemed thicker now, like the whole room was leaning in, waiting for the moment she'd fold. But she didn't. She simply offered a quiet thank you, and returned to her spot against the wall, heart still hammering but breath held even. Outside, the night had fallen fast. The Mississippi sky was a dark canvas scattered with dim stars, barely visible between the street lamps. Leona walked slowly with Marcus, her cousin, the pavement cool beneath their sneakers, the faint scent of fried food and gasoline drifting from a distant corner store. "Girl, you're wild," Marcus said, shaking his head, though his tone carried more admiration than concern. "You just challenged a federal judge on his turf." Leona half smiled but didn't look at him. Her eyes were still on the sidewalk, her thoughts caught between pride and dread. "I didn't challenge," she murmured. "I asked a question." Marcus laughed low and warm. "Yeah. But you asked it with fire in your eyes." People felt that. A breeze rustled through the trees lining the sidewalk, sending dry leaves skittering across the curb. Leona pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She didn't feel brave, not really, just tired of waiting for someone else to speak. Maybe that's what courage actually was, not a feeling, but a choice made again and again, even when it didn't feel like enough. Marcus's voice softened. He looked pissed, you know. "Mercer, like you hit a nerve." Leona shrugged her fingers, still curled tight in her pocket. Then maybe it needed hitting, she said quietly. At the corner, the old stop sign creaked on its post, swaying slightly as a pickup rumbled past, with headlights cutting through the dark. The silence that followed felt longer than it really was. Leona turned, finally looking up at Marcus, her breath visible now in the cooler night air. "Do you think they'll come after me for this?" she asked. Not dramatic, just honest. Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long second, the street lamp casting half his face in gold, the other in shadow. "I think people like him don't like being questioned by girls like you. But I also think he just saw what the next generation looks like, and it scared him." Leona nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in fear but in focus. The old courthouse loomed behind them, its tall white columns barely visible against the sky, like a ghost from a history that never really died. She stared at it a moment longer, then turned away, her footsteps firm against the concrete. Somewhere deep in her chest something had shifted. Not broken, not burdened, but sharpened like steel cooling after fire. The street had quieted by the time Leona and Marcus turned onto Martin Luther King Drive, their footsteps muffled against the cracked concrete, echoing faintly between rows of worn duplexes and idle porch swings. The air had that strange stillness that settles over a southern neighborhood after the day's noise has faded, when conversations slip behind screen doors and the scent of fried catfish or slow-cooked collards lingers like memory. Marcus walked a step ahead, tossing a half-empty bottle of soda from one hand to the other, his breath rising in slow, even puffs. Leona stayed just behind her eyes, darting up now and then toward the dark windows lining the street, some glowing faintly with blue television light, some dark like sealed vaults. Neither of them said much at first. The adrenaline from the town hall meeting was still wearing off, and Leona could feel it in her legs, a strange mix of pride and tension that made each step feel heavier than the last. "You hungry?" Marcus finally asked, glancing back over his shoulder, the crooked grin on his face, trying to make the night feel normal. Leona shook her head. "Not really," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. Her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her bag, the canvas rough beneath her thumb, grounding her just enough to stay focused. "You sure? We got leftover cornbread. I think Aunt Lorraine made chili." She managed a smile, soft and fleeting. "Maybe later." They were halfway past the old corner store, shuttered since the spring floods, when the headlights hit them. Bright, sudden, too fast for a residential street. Marcus turned instinctively, squinting, raising one hand to shield his face. Leona froze one step behind her body, going still in that peculiar way a deer does when it's already too late to run. The cruiser rolled up, fast tires scraping loose gravel, and stopped with a hard, deliberate jerk just feet from where they stood. The spotlight snapped on, harsh and blinding, catching them both full in the face. For a long breath, no one moved. The world narrowed to that beam of light, and the mechanical whir of the patrol car's engine ticking beneath the hood. Marcus's hand went up slowly. Fingers splayed his voice, low and even. "We're just walking, officers," he said, though no one had spoken from the car yet. Leona swallowed the dryness in her throat and took half a step forward, eyes wide but focused. A door slammed. Loud. The kind of loud that doesn't just end, it echoes off walls and into bones. A tall figure emerged, broad-shouldered, pale face, partially shadowed by the cruiser's roof lights. One hand hovered just above the weapon on his belt, not quite resting but close enough to say everything. "Hands up," he barked, already walking toward them. "Now." Marcus obeyed immediately, raising both arms above his head, his voice cracking slightly. "We live 2 blocks down," he said, his tone pleading without begging. "We're just coming from a public meeting." Leona didn't speak yet. Her mind was racing, but her body remained still. She knew this part, the freeze. The wrong move, the wrong word, even a blink too slow could tilt everything. She slowly reached into her coat pocket, fingers brushing the folded flyer from the town hall, and then lifted her arms too. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling but clear, "under state policy, stop and question procedures require a statement of cause before—" The officer took 2 hard steps forward, face twisted, mouth tight. "I don't need a damn civics lesson," he snapped. "You think quoting the law makes you untouchable?" His eyes locked onto Leona like she'd just lit a match in a gas station, and suddenly Marcus was stepping in front of her, his posture protective, his shoulders braced. "She's 16, he said, low and urgent. "She's just a kid." The officer's expression didn't change. If anything, it darkened. A second door creaked open, and another officer stepped out, shorter, stockier, silent. He didn't speak, just stood by the cruiser with one hand resting on the doorframe, eyes unreadable. Leona could feel her chest tighten, breath trapped somewhere between fear and fury. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to beg. She wanted to believe that facts mattered. That words could hold space against violence. "We have the right to be here," she said again, slower this time, each syllable carefully weighed. "We didn't do anything wrong." The officer moved faster than she expected. 1 second he was 3 feet away, the next he was in her space, reaching for her wrist. She flinched backward instinctively, and just like that the switch flipped. He shoved Marcus aside, drew a taser, and leveled it at her chest in one practiced motion. Leona heard the pop before she felt it. A jolt like fire and ice all at once surged through her body, seizing her muscles, arching her spine, knocking her backward onto the concrete with a heavy thud. Her bag tumbled from her shoulder papers, spilling like scattered leaves in the dark. Her vision swam. Her ears rang. Marcus shouted her name loud, hoarse, full of disbelief, but she couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't breathe right. Somewhere nearby, a door creaked open. A porch light flicked on. A dog barked once, then again. Leona blinked up at the sky, the stars now blurry behind a sheet of tears she hadn't realized were falling. She thought she heard someone whisper her name, maybe Marcus, maybe herself. But the night had stopped making sense. The cold seeped into her spine, her fingertips curled into the sidewalk. And as the sounds faded, the gravel crunching, the murmurs, the static of the officer's radio, Leona's mind clung to one last flickering thought. This cannot be what justice looks like. Then darkness folded in soft and complete, and the world went quiet. The first thing Leona noticed when she opened her eyes was the buzzing overhead, harsh, mechanical, and ceaseless, like a swarm of flies circling inside her skull. She didn't remember falling, didn't remember being moved, but the ache in her back and the cold slab beneath her made it clear she was no longer on the street. The fluorescent light above flickered, once humming in that low, static way that made everything feel unreal, like she'd stepped into a hospital scene from someone else's nightmare. Her limbs felt heavy, not from sleep, but from something deeper, like electricity had lingered in her muscles, clinging to the marrow itself, humming beneath her skin. Her mouth was dry, her lips cracked, her tongue swollen against the roof of her mouth. When she tried to shift metal, scraped concrete, sharp, hollow, unmistakable. Her wrists were cuffed, her ankles too. Panic tried to rise, clawing up from her chest like something feral, but she pushed it down the way she'd been taught. Slow breath in, slower breath out. Anchor yourself to what's real. The air smelled of bleach metal and something faintly sour. Around her, silence lingered like dust in a forgotten attic, broken only by the distant sound of boots echoing against linoleum and a cough from somewhere far down the hall. She sat up slowly, muscles, trembling eyes, adjusting to the stark white walls and the thick metal bars that framed her cell like a cage built for something dangerous. Across from her, other cells stretched into dim corners, each one holding a shadow of someone not much older than her. A boy, maybe 12, curled in one corner with his arms around his knees, rocking without rhythm. In another, a girl with long braids muttered to herself, eyes fixed on a crack in the wall as if it might open and swallow her whole. No one spoke. No one cried. It was the kind of silence that knew it didn't need to be loud to control you. Leona swallowed, winced, then wiped her lips with the back of her sleeve. Her throat burned. Her head throbbed, but it was the pressure behind her eyes that hurt the most. The weight of what she had lost, what had been taken from her in the blink of a spotlight. The freedom of a walk home. The pride of having spoken truth to power. The security of knowing someone would be there to protect her. Gone, all of it in one snap of a taser and a hard fall to the pavement. She touched her temple gingerly and found dried blood crusted along her hairline. Voices floated down the corridor, faint at first, then louder as a group of officers passed the far end of the hall. Their boots clicked with easy rhythm, and their laughter was too casual, too loud. She quoted some court ruling, one voice said with a mocking lilt, like she was some damn child lawyer. Another responded with a chuckle, deep and cruel. Didn't matter. Dropped like a sack of bricks the second that taser hit. Whole speech went flying. They laughed again, the sound bouncing off tile and steel, scraping against Leona's chest like a blade she couldn't see. She closed her eyes, let the heat rise, and then fade. And she whispered, barely audible, Fourth Amendment. Due process. Miranda. Words she'd memorized. Words that were supposed to mean something. She repeated them like a prayer, not to be rescued, but to remember who she was, what she knew. Her mind was still hers. They couldn't strip that away. She could feel the steel bar at her back cold through her sweatshirt, and she pressed harder into it, steadying her breath. There was no comfort here, but there could still be clarity. Somewhere across the hall, the younger boy caught her gaze. His eyes were wide and hollow, but for a second they met hers. He didn't speak, but the question in his face was unmistakable. "Do we matter?" She gave the smallest nod she could manage. Not much, but enough. Enough to say, "I see you. I'm still here. You're not alone." Footsteps returned. A guard passed, this one silent clipboard in hand, eyes skimming down the cells like checking livestock. Leona didn't move. She watched him go without a word. When he disappeared again into the hum of overhead lights and peeling paint, she let her shoulders drop a fraction. The pain in her chest hadn't faded, but it was becoming familiar now, part of the air, part of the silence. Her mother didn't know where she was. Marcus didn't know if she was alive. No lawyer had come. No questions had been asked. She wasn't even sure what she was being charged with or if anyone had bothered to write it down. But the one thing she knew, the one truth that had rooted itself deep inside her ribcage, was that this wasn't just about her anymore. She looked around at the quiet forms in the other cells. Kids with dark skin and tired eyes curled against cold corners like shadows someone forgot to name. This was about all of them. Every one of them who had been silenced, mocked, detained, ignored. And if she ever made it out of this place, it wouldn't be just to tell her story. It would be to pull back the curtain and show the world what these halls really held. Not justice, not order, just control. She took another breath. Slower this time. The tremble in her hands was still there, but she let it be. Some things were supposed to shake. That's how you knew they were real. As she leaned back against the wall and stared up at the humming light above her, she didn't pray for rescue or vengeance. She didn't cry for her mother or call out for help. Instead, she whispered to herself, her voice steady. "Remember this, every sound, every face, every minute they kept you quiet. Because silence might hold the walls, but memory, that was how you shattered them." The courtroom smelled of old polish and time, like a place that had forgotten what justice was supposed to feel like, and now only remembered how to perform it. Leona's ankles were shackled, her wrists still marked from tight restraints, and each step across the polished floor echoed too loudly, like her presence itself was an offense. Two guards flanked her on either side, their movements impersonal, eyes forward, never meeting hers, as if they were escorting a file folder instead of a girl. She held her head up anyway, not out of defiance, but because the weight of the moment demanded it. If she lowered her gaze now, she might not find the strength to raise it again. Her mother sat in the back row motionless, a bundle of tension in a brown wool coat, hands clenched tightly around the strap of her purse. Their eyes met for just a breath, just enough to exchange what couldn't be said aloud. "I'm scared. I'm here. Don't let them take you too." Leona gave a barely visible nod, her lips pressed into a line, then turned her attention back to the bench, where Judge Hollis Mercer had just entered, his black robe flowing behind him like a curtain drawn across a stage. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice mechanical, but the sound of people standing carried a different kind of gravity. Dull thuds of shoes against tile-shifting coats, the stiff air of forced reverence. Judge Mercer moved like he'd done this 1,000 times before, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere deep in his bones. He adjusted the papers before him without looking up, then lifted his chin eyes, scanning the room with slow disdain before settling on Leona. "We are here to address the charges brought against Miss Leona Harper," he said, his tone flat, official, hollow. "Resisting arrest, interfering with a police investigation, exhibiting dangerous defiance of lawful authority." Each word landed with weight, not because they carried truth, but because of how easily they could be spoken, as if truth didn't matter. Leona stood tall, though her legs still ached from the cold cell, and her heart thundered against her ribs. She raised her hand slowly, carefully, the way she'd been taught to in school, not courtrooms. Mercer's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation passing across his face. "Yes," he said, as if humoring a child. Leona cleared her throat, steadying her voice. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that the record reflect procedural violations in my arrest and detainment." A few clerks looked up. One typed something slowly. Mercer tilted his head, the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "Is that so?" he said, his voice dripping with mock patience. "And where, might I ask, did you learn such sophisticated legal insight?" Leona didn't blink. "In school, and from my uncle." That name hung unsaid but heavy. Mercer's smile faded. "I invoke in Regalt," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Juveniles are entitled to due process. I was not notified of my rights, nor was I permitted counsel. I was not read Miranda at the time of my arrest." Mercer slammed his palm on the bench, a sharp crack that reverberated through the room like a gunshot in a cathedral. "Enough," he barked, rising suddenly. "You think parroting a few fancy terms makes you a lawyer, makes you above this court?" The room stilled. Even the guards behind her shifted, unsure whether to intervene. Leona didn't move. She just kept breathing slow and deliberate. "No, Your Honor," she said. "It doesn't make me above the court. It means I still have the right to ask why it's failing me." Mercer's face flushed a deep red, the color creeping into his neck like something boiling beneath the surface. He came around the bench faster than anyone expected for a man his age, his robe snapping behind him, his shoes striking the floor with purpose. He stopped just inches from her. She looked up at him, eyes wide, but unflinching, her arms still at her sides. "You will learn respect," he hissed, and before the words had even fully left his mouth, his hand rose and struck her hard across the cheek. The sound echoed clean, brutal, final. A gasp tore through the courtroom, sharp and collective. A clerk dropped a pen. Her mother cried out from the back, a sound strangled in her throat before it became a scream. The guards didn't move. No one moved. Leona stumbled but did not fall. She blinked, her face burning, the sting already blooming across her skin like a bruise inked in fire. She looked back at him, calm, direct, furious, in a way that didn't shout but seethed. With slow precision, she raised her hand to her sleeve and pulled out a small, worn cell phone from a hidden pocket. Her thumb moved with quiet purpose. One tap, then another. The screen glowed. She typed 2 words. It happened. Then she hit send. Judge Mercer's face went pale in an instant. His eyes locked on the phone, and something in his posture changed, not with anger, but with recognition. He knew who she was really speaking to, and more importantly, he knew who would be listening. Leona slid the phone back into her sleeve and lowered her hand, saying nothing more. She didn't need to. The shift had already begun, like the faint tremor that comes before an earthquake, silent but impossible to ignore. For a moment, the entire room remained suspended in that breath between denial and consequence. Leona stood in the center, not just as a girl accused, but as something else entirely, a mirror held up to a system that hated being seen. And in that mirror, Mercer caught a glimpse of himself, not as he had once imagined a steward of justice, but as something much smaller and infinitely more dangerous, a man who had lost control of his narrative. Leona exhaled slowly, her jaw tight, her eyes unblinking. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help. She didn't look to the judge or to the audience for validation. Instead, she turned ever so slightly toward the rows of empty benches, and let her gaze drift upward toward the light streaming faintly through the high barred windows. It wasn't hope that filled her chest. It was resolve, quiet and relentless, like the slow forming of stone under pressure. In the seconds after the slap, after the judge's hand had returned to his side and the stunned silence swallowed the room, Leona did not cry, did not speak, and did not stumble again. Her cheek pulsed with a heat that radiated into her jaw, her neck, and up through her scalp, but she stood still, straight and frighteningly calm. Her breath came slow and deep, not from peace, but from discipline, the kind you only learn when silence is your first armor. For a moment she simply looked at him, Judge Mercer, with a kind of steadiness that unsettled something ancient and brittle in the space between them. Then, without speaking, without asking permission or waiting for approval, she slipped her fingers into the narrow seam at the cuff of her sleeve and pulled out a phone no one had noticed she had. It was old, the screen slightly scratched. The case faded from use, but it worked and it was ready. She didn't glance around. She didn't flinch as the bailiff took a step forward. She just typed 2 words. It happened. Then she pressed send. 1 click, 1 breath, and the ripple began. The judge didn't react at first, but when he saw her thumb move, saw the blue flash of the message, confirmed something in his posture shifted. Not visibly, not enough for the courtroom to name, but subtly, like a man suddenly aware that the walls are no longer keeping things out but trapping something in. His hand fell to his side, fingers curling into a fist so tightly the knuckles paled. Leona returned the phone to its hiding place and looked up, her chin, lifted, her eyes clear. She didn't say who she had texted. She didn't need to. The power wasn't in the explanation. It was in the certainty. The guards didn't move to restrain her. The courtroom clerk, who had been staring wide-eyed from behind her monitor, glanced down at her screen like she'd just remembered where she was. And from the back of the room, her mother's breath hitched, audible, ragged, and full of something that wasn't just fear anymore. Leona allowed herself one deep exhale, a release not of weakness but of control, like a storm finally breaking across dry land. Inside the quiet, something changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but the room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the truth itself had begun to take up space. Mercer stepped back slowly, eyes still locked on Leona's face, and for the first time since she had entered that courtroom he looked uncertain, not panicked, not defeated, but aware that something he could not name had slipped beyond his grasp. "We're done here," he said, voice lower now, less performative, as if trying to reclaim the moment before it slipped completely away. Leona said nothing. She didn't nod, she didn't argue. She simply turned slightly toward the gallery, scanning the faces that had gathered, most of them. Strangers, a few of them. Silent supporters. One of them, her mother, trembling, watching, silently mouthing the words baby girl, over like a prayer held together by memory. The guard at her side made a motion, as if to escort her back to the holding room, but stopped mid-step when she looked at him, not with challenge, but with such clarity that he hesitated, uncertain if his authority still held weight in the room they now stood in. Outside, beyond the courthouse walls, the city hummed, as it always did, cars pushing through intersections, buses sighing at red lights, the occasional echo of a horn or siren blending into the background noise of another southern afternoon. But in that courtroom, time had shifted, not stalled, not stopped, but recalibrated, as if the balance of power had leaned ever so slightly in a new direction. And all it had taken was 2 words and the courage to send them. Leona followed the guard out without looking back at Mercer. She didn't need to. She had seen all she needed. The slap was done. The bruise would come. But what mattered now was that she had chosen to respond not with silence, not with shame, but with something stronger, something he hadn't expected: information, connection, and the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly who she had become. And as she stepped through the threshold of the courtroom doors, the last thing she saw before they closed behind her was the pale shaft of sunlight falling across the judge's bench. It lit the space where he had stood moments ago, casting long, clean lines across the polished wood, like a reminder that nothing, no matter how old or powerful, escapes the light forever. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Justice Naomi Caldwell's office in Washington, D.C., was pale and cold, the kind of light that didn't warm the room but only revealed how still everything inside it had become. Her chambers, usually arranged with quiet precision, a small vase of fresh white lilies, a neat stack of legal journals, a photograph of her late brother from his college graduation, felt suddenly distant, like a place paused in time. The secure phone on her desk buzzed once, then fell silent again, its screen still glowing faintly with the message that had just arrived. 2 words. It happened. Naomi sat very still, not frozen with fear, not stunned into inaction, but quiet in a way that only those who had carried too much for too long could be. She didn't move to pick up the phone again. She didn't reach for her glasses or adjust her chair. Her fingers, long and graceful, rested lightly on the desk, as if she were holding something invisible between them, something fragile and sacred, like a thread pulled tight across decades. She closed her eyes briefly, let the breath she'd been holding slip out, and whispered under it almost inaudibly, "Leona." The name didn't feel like a surprise. It felt inevitable. She had always known somewhere in her marrow that the weight she had once buried wouldn't stay buried forever. That truth has a way of finding its way back through bloodlines. But knowing something and receiving it like this, blunt and final in the soft blue glow of a message, were entirely different things. She stood slowly, the stiffness in her knees a reminder of how long she'd been seated in power, and walked across the room to a locked cabinet set flush against the wall. Her hand hesitated for a beat above the keypad, the combination still memorized but rarely used. She entered it with practiced care. The lock gave with a dull click, and inside, beneath layers of newer case files and policy briefs, sat an old brown folder, marked in black ink. The words Devon Caldwell, 1997, had faded but were still legible, the letters curved with a younger man's hand. Naomi pulled it out carefully, the edges worn and the paper inside soft with age, and placed it on the desk like one might return a folded flag. Her breath caught again as she opened it, and there in the middle of the stack of documents lay the autopsy report she had read 100 times in the dark, each word branded into her memory like heat pressed to skin. She turned the pages slowly, methodically, as if looking for something she hadn't already memorized long ago. Witness testimonies redacted, chain of evidence compromised. Internal memos cryptic and suggestive, never conclusive. And there it was again, that name that had haunted the footnotes and margins for decades. Hollis Mercer. Then a defense attorney slick and rising fast, now a judge with robes blacker than his conscience. The man who had defended the officer who left her brother bleeding in an alley and won. Naomi pressed her hands against the desk, her knuckles white, her jaw clenched with the kind of rage that had calcified over years into something colder and more dangerous than grief. She thought of Leona now, not as the girl in that courtroom, but as the baby in the photograph tucked into her brother's wallet, round-cheeked, wide-eyed, reaching toward the camera like she believed the world would reach back. Naomi had stepped away from the family after Devon's death, had drowned herself in clerking in constitutional law, in precedent and detachment, all in the name of protecting something bigger than herself. You can do more good from the inside, they had told her. Swallow the personal. Change the system from the bench. She had believed them once, but now, staring at the echo of that old file and feeling the tremor still hanging in the air from Leona's message, she saw it clearly. Some battles were never meant to be buried under strategy. Some truths weren't meant to wait for permission. She picked up the secure line, her voice steady but lower than usual. "Connect me with Nadia Trent," she said, and when the assistant on the other end asked why, she only replied, "Tell her it's Justice Caldwell, and I have a story." Nadia answered on the third ring, her voice unmistakable, sharp, quick, and unforgiving, the same voice that had dismantled entire careers with a single headline. "Didn't expect to hear from you again," she said, her tone not unkind, just honest. Naomi hesitated only briefly. "I need your discretion," she said, "and your fire." There was a pause on the other end, then a shift. "What's the story?" "Judicial misconduct, cover-ups, a pattern stretching back decades. And it starts with a girl. A 15-year-old girl in Mississippi." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Nadia responded with a calm she didn't often use. "You sure you want to open this door?" Naomi looked down at the folder again, then out through the window where the Capitol dome stood bathed in the unforgiving light of morning. "It's already open," she said. "I'm just making sure people see what's inside." She ended the call and remained standing, one hand still resting lightly on the folder, the other gripping the edge of the desk. Outside, the city moved, with its usual pace: appointments, scheduled meetings held, decisions made. But inside that office, something had shifted. Naomi Caldwell was no longer the judge content to steer from within. She was something else now. Not the same woman who had accepted silence as a price of survival, but someone remembering what justice was supposed to sound like. She reached for her robe and didn't put it on. Instead, she set it on the chair, neatly folded, and sat again, not with the posture of someone burdened by the weight of office, but with the steadiness of someone finally ready to carry the truth. Her gaze lifted one last time to the picture of Devon on the corner shelf, and this time when she looked at his face, she didn't feel shame for what she hadn't done. She felt something sharper, quieter, like the edge of purpose returning to a blade, long kept sheathed. Justice wasn't a theory anymore. It was family, it was blood, and it had just called her name. The wind that evening carried a bitter edge, brushing against the windows of the Harper home like an old warning whispered through the glass. Inside the kitchen, lights glowed with a quiet warmth that felt thinner than usual, stretched across too much silence and too many unspoken fears. The air smelled faintly of cornbread and rosemary, but no one was eating. Danielle Harper stood at the sink, one hand gripping the counter, the other pressed to her forehead, her eyes fixed on nothing. Leona sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, its screen glowing softly against the low light, casting sharp shadows under her eyes. Her fingertips hovered above the keyboard, tense and uncertain like a pianist, unsure whether to strike a chord or hold the silence. Across from her, Marcus sat with one leg, bouncing arms crossed tightly over his chest, staring at the fridge, as if it might offer an answer to a question no one dared ask aloud. The television in the living room murmured in the background, some cable anchor speculating on courthouse unrest, voice too casual for the weight of what had happened. Outside cars passed occasionally, their headlights streaking across the blinds like phantom searchlights scanning the walls for cracks. No one had spoken in 10 minutes. Not really, just short exchanges. Did you eat? I'm fine. Did you sleep a little? But the words didn't hold meaning. They were placeholders. Delay tactics. Everyone was waiting for the same thing, the conversation that would break what little peace they had left. Finally, Danielle turned from the sink, her voice flat but steady. We need to talk about what happens now. Marcus looked up immediately. Leona didn't. She kept her eyes on the screen, scrolling through a document titled Legal Precedents, Youth Rights, and Detainment Violations. Danielle crossed the room slowly and leaned against the counter beside the stove, arms folded, lips pressed tight. Leona, she said, firmer, this time you can't keep doing this. It's not safe. Leona looked up then, her face calm but drawn the bruise on her cheek, now a soft shadow blooming beneath her skin. I know, she said quietly. That's why I have to keep doing it. Danielle's fingers tightened on her arm. They're following Marcus, she said, voice rising, despite her effort to contain it. Someone took pictures of him outside the school. 2 strange men parked across from the house this morning. Do you understand what that means? Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck, his posture tense but quiet. She's not wrong, he said. They're watching us. Leona looked between them, her jaw tightening, her voice low and clear. That doesn't mean we stop. Danielle stepped forward, her voice shaking, now not with anger, but with something deeper, grief twisted into fear. You're 15, Leona. You don't get to play hero with people like this. They don't play fair. They don't lose gracefully. Leona pushed the laptop closed with a soft click, and stood slowly, her back straight, her hands flat on the table. You think I don't know that? She asked, not loudly, but with an edge that cut through the room like broken glass. You think I didn't feel it when he hit me, or when they cuffed me, or when I woke up in a concrete cell surrounded by kids who'd done nothing but be poor and black in the wrong zip code? Her voice didn't waver. It rose only slightly, just enough to carry its truth across the quiet house. I know what this is. But if we stop now, then they win. Then that courtroom stays silent. And all of this, everything Uncle Devon lived and died for, gets erased. Danielle stepped back like the words had hit her, blinking fast, her breath catching. For a moment her face softened, but then it hardened again, not out of coldness but survival. I already lost my brother to this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't lose you too. Leona's expression faltered for just a breath, just enough for the hurt to show. Then she looked away toward the darkened window, where her own reflection stared back at her, too young to carry this, too old to pretend she couldn't. Marcus stood now too, moving beside her. We don't have to fight this alone, he said, his voice lower, more even. There are people out there who believe in what you're doing, who've seen it, felt it. Leona nodded, once her jaw tightening again. Then we need to show them we're not afraid. Even if we are. Danielle sat down slowly, heavily, like someone surrendering not to defeat but to the inevitability of what her daughter had become. She looked at Leona, really looked at her, and saw not a child, but something more complicated. Courage braided with fear, purpose lined with bruises. The moment stretched, held by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock, until Danielle finally whispered, "Then we protect each other. No more risks alone. No more secrets." Leona nodded again. And Marcus added, "We move smart." Together, it wasn't a resolution, not really, just an agreement that if the fire was coming they would face it side by side. Leona reopened the laptop, her fingers steadier, now moving across the keys with precision. "I'm writing a public statement," she said. "Not just about what happened to me, but about what's been happening to everyone else too." Marcus leaned over to look. Danielle didn't speak, but she watched her daughter choose her next battle, not because she wanted to fight, but because the silence around them had become unbearable. The room felt different now. Not safer. Not calmer. But clearer, like the fog had lifted just enough to reveal what lay ahead. They were in danger. That much was obvious. But they weren't helpless. And in the flickering light of the kitchen, surrounded by family and memory, and the faint, persistent thrum of resistance, Leona began to type, not for attention, not for revenge, but to be heard. Outside, the wind had calmed. The neighborhood remained quiet. But inside that small house on the corner of Oakwood and Perry, something had shifted. Not in fear, but in resolve. Leona's hands moved steadily now, her eyes sharp, her voice ready. And for the first time since the courtroom, the air didn't feel heavy with dread. It felt full of what comes next. The library at Carter High wasn't built for revolutions, but that afternoon, beneath its flickering fluorescent lights and cracked ceiling tiles, something undeniable began to form. The heavy tables, scarred by years of pencil marks and forgotten gum wrappers, became command centers, their surfaces buried beneath printouts, laptops, sticky notes, and law books borrowed from nearby colleges. The faint hum of the old heating vents blended with the soft clatter of keys and the hushed voices of teenagers who had stopped thinking like students and started thinking like strategists. Leona sat at the far end of the room, her fingers laced beneath her chin, eyes scanning a spreadsheet on her screen, while Marcus typed beside her eyes, darting between two browser tabs. Around them sat 9 others, some from other districts, some from other states, each one drawn to the cause, not by fame or clicks, but by something quieter and heavier, the need to understand what was broken and how to begin fixing it. There was Zara from Chicago, barely 16, who had already reverse-engineered the language behind predictive policing algorithms. And Noah from New Orleans, quiet but brilliant, whose obsession with court transcripts had unearthed more than one disturbing pattern of judicial bias. Each of them had brought something to the table, skills, sharpened not in classrooms but in lived experiences that had taught them early on that rules weren't written for kids like them. Leona looked up and spoke, her voice calm but carrying weight. "We're not a court of law," she said, "but we are a court of truth." The words didn't echo. They settled. Everyone stopped what they were doing for a moment, the weight of that sentence grounding them in shared purpose. "We're not here to punish," she continued. "We're here to expose. And if we do this right, no one will be able to pretend they didn't know." Maya, the constitutional debate champion from California, leaned forward. "We start with the rulings," she said, tapping her pen against a binder. 20 years of Judge Mercer's cases, sentencing patterns, language usage, demographics. We need to know who he punished hardest and how he justified it." Leona nodded. "That's your team," she said. "Maya, Noah, and Jonah. Find the cracks he tried to seal with legal language." She turned to Marcus, whose screen displayed a coding interface running a complex set of linguistic filters. "Bias detection," he nodded. "Already scraping for keywords across 1,000 pages of transcripts," he said, comparing them to controlled judges from other counties. "The patterns are already ugly." Leona didn't flinch. "They always are," she said. "It's just that this time we'll have proof." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. A sudden laugh burst from one of the younger volunteers, nervous energy more than humor, but it faded quickly, replaced by the tapping of more keys, the rustle of more paper. Leona's screen displayed the beginnings of an organizational chart, lines connecting names to tasks, protocols, deadlines. At the top was the title they had agreed on the night before: the People's Record, Youth Tribunal for Judicial Accountability. It felt ambitious, maybe even ridiculous, but it was also real. She leaned back in her chair and glanced across the room, watching these kids, these strangers turned allies, lean into the work as if their own futures depended on it. Because they did. "We have 2 weeks, she said, drawing the room's attention again. 2 weeks to gather, verify, and prepare. Then we go live. Not just on social media, but in a live stream open to journalists, educators, anyone who cares about the truth." Zara raised her hand slightly. "You think they'll watch?" she asked, voice cautious. Leona met her gaze. "I don't know," she said. "But I know they'll remember it if they do." Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of intention, of fingers returning to keyboards, of pages being turned, and data being sorted. At one point, someone ordered pizza, but most slices sat untouched as graphs were built, citations checked, and timelines assembled. Leona worked without pausing, not out of urgency, but out of clarity, out of the simple understanding that this was the kind of work people waited too long to begin. Her mother didn't know she was at the library, not yet. And part of her felt the weight of that lie tightening across her ribs like a belt. But she also knew this wasn't a secret born from rebellion, it was born from necessity. There were things parents couldn't understand until it was too late, and Leona couldn't wait for the day her mother gave permission to fight the very system that had buried her uncle. That permission had to come from inside, from that quiet voice that refused to be quiet any longer. As evening settled and the shadows from the bookshelves stretched longer across the worn carpet, Leona saved the working document, backed up the drive, and looked up at her team. "Tomorrow we'll review the first 50 rulings," she said, her voice steady. "Tonight, I want everyone to rest, real rest, because what we're about to do, it's going to rattle things." Noah gave a small nod, adjusting his glasses. Maya packed her bag slowly, her eyes still on the whiteboard covered in red and blue markers. Marcus closed his laptop, then glanced over at Leona. "You really think we can crack this?" he asked, not as a challenge but as someone needing to hear her say it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the table, the scratch marks, the gum, the names carved into its surface like 1,000 little protests. Then she looked up, her voice calm and unmistakably sure. "I don't think we can crack it," she said. "I think we already have. We're just showing the world what the pieces look like." And with that, they began to pack up their movements, tired but purposeful. The lights flickered once more before going dark behind them, and the door to the library closed with a soft click that felt more like the beginning of something than the end. At exactly 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time, the live stream began, not with music or flashing graphics, but with a quiet screen that read only 4 words: Youth Tribunal for Accountability. The camera was still at first fixed on a single frame, where Leona sat alone at a wooden desk, the walls behind her draped with plain navy cloth lit softly by a single desk lamp. Her face was calm, serious, almost too still for someone barely 16, but there was something in her eyes, something focused and unwavering, that made you stop and listen before she even said a word. She leaned forward slightly, rested her hands on the table, and began to speak in a tone clear and unhurried, like someone inviting you to sit down before telling you something you didn't want to believe but needed to hear. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice measured. "We are not here to tell you what to think. We are here to show you what the truth looks like and what the numbers can no longer hide." Her breath was steady. Her hands didn't shake. Behind her, the quiet buzz of the stream began to build, first a few hundred viewers, then thousands, then more. The screen split as Maya Chen appeared on the right, her background, a collage of legal textbooks and color-coded graphs pinned to a corkboard. "Let's begin with the data," she said, tapping a key to display the first set of charts. Bar graphs appeared in clean, contrasting colors side by side, comparisons of sentencing lengths. Black and brown youth received sentences 2 to 4 times longer than white youth for nearly identical charges, Maya explained. Same judge, same courtroom, same statutes, but entirely different outcomes. As she spoke, the chat filled with reactions. Some typed in disbelief. Others said nothing, just dropped emojis of broken scales and clenched fists. The graphs gave way to photographs, young faces blurred for privacy, their stories captioned beneath: theft, under $100, 6 months, first offense marijuana, 8 months, vandalism, 1 year. Every one of them a teenager, every one of them punished harder because of who they were. Then the screen shifted again, and Marcus Reyes took over. "Let's talk about language," he said, his tone sharper. "Because sometimes the bias doesn't scream it, whispers." He displayed court transcripts run through AI software built to detect weighted terms. Here he pointed: black defendants were described as volatile, uncooperative, urban, aggressive. Then he showed transcripts from white defendants with the same charges, promising future. Momentary lapse, immaturity. Marcus paused, not for drama, but to let the words hang where they belonged in the minds of the viewers now watching in silence. "This is not random," he said. "This is designed, subtle, systemic, and it has consequences." By now, the stream had passed 100,000 viewers. The chat was moving too fast to read. Screenshots were already circulating. Hashtags were forming. But Leona didn't look at the numbers. She stayed focused on the notes in front of her, on the weight of what came next. "We know this alone is not enough," she said quietly, "because people in power always find a way to call the truth a distortion. So we brought more." She tapped her keyboard, and the next slide was not a graph, but an email, one with no redactions, no edits, no ambiguity. "This message was obtained through a whistleblower," she said. "It was written by District Attorney Sloan, and it was sent to Judge Hollis Mercer." She let the message sit on screen as she read it aloud. "Teen advocacy movements are gaining traction. We must neutralize threats before they gain institutional support." A hush fell across the digital space. She continued. "Containment approved. Silence is our strongest ally." The silence after those words was different. It wasn't just shock, it was recognition. That somewhere deep down, people had always known something was wrong. They just hadn't seen it this clearly before. The stream cut back to Leona's face. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry. She looked like someone standing in a storm without flinching. "We know this may not lead to indictments tomorrow," she said, her voice low. "But today we make sure that silence is no longer their strongest ally." And then, with almost no warning, the final segment played. A scratchy audio file recorded from an internal meeting filled the feed. Mercer's voice was unmistakable. "They're just street kids," he said, laughing. "Give them time. They'll all be back in court for real crimes." Another voice joined in Sloane's, "We don't need to beat them in court. Just stall them until they burn out. That's the game." The clip ended. The chat exploded. Some wrote in all caps. Some just typed, "No more games." Leona didn't say anything for a full 10 seconds. She looked directly into the camera. Then she spoke again, softer now, but with the same unshakable clarity. "You cannot unhear what you've heard. You cannot unknow what justice demands." The screen faded to a single line. Session 1 complete. Evidence package now available for public download. And just like that, the feed ended. No music, no applause. Just the slow, quiet exit of 100,000 viewers who had come expecting a live stream and left having witnessed a reckoning. Leona closed her laptop and sat for a moment in the stillness. Behind her, someone placed a hand gently on her shoulder, Marcus steady and quiet. "You did it," he whispered. Leona didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, still resting on the desk, still warm from the keys. "No," she said. "We started it." And outside the window, as the last light faded from the sky, the streets of the city held a new kind of tension, one not built on fear, but on the quiet electricity of something long silenced, beginning at last to speak. The morning news hit like a stone thrown through a glass window, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore once shattered. Judge Hollis Mercer stood stiffly behind a polished oak podium, his face carefully arranged into a mask of weary dignity, though the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed the tension barely held beneath his skin. Cameras clicked with mechanical rhythm as reporters angled for better shots, microphones crowding in close like vultures, circling a man who had not yet admitted he was bleeding. His voice, when it came, was measured and theatrical, the kind of cadence perfected by decades of ruling rooms where no one was allowed to speak without his permission. "We are witnessing," he began, pausing just long enough to let the words settle, "an unprecedented attack on the integrity of our judicial system driven not by truth but by reckless youth and foreign influence." The crowd shifted. A few hands rose to ask questions, but Mercer raised a palm, silencing them with the same motion he might use to dismiss a defendant in court. "Let me be clear," he continued, eyes sweeping the cameras. "This is not activism, it is sabotage, and it will not stand." Behind him, District Attorney Victor Sloane nodded solemnly, holding a manila folder as if it contained the smoking gun of a counter-narrative. "We have evidence," Sloane said, voice oiled with just enough gravity, "that these so-called tribunals are being funded and coached by radical organizations seeking to undermine American values." He didn't show the evidence, of course, just waved the folder like a flag, hoping the image would outlast the facts. Leona watched the press conference from her kitchen table, the screen of her laptop angled just slightly to block the morning light. Her mother stood a few feet away, arms crossed, pacing slowly between the stove and the fridge, while Marcus sat silent by the window, his expression unreadable. The room smelled faintly of reheated coffee and cinnamon toast, but no one had touched the food. The sound of Mercer's voice filled the space like smoke curling into corners, clinging to walls thick with insinuation. "They're trying to smear us," Leona said finally, her tone not angry, just tired. "They know what's coming next and they're scared." Danielle turned toward her face, tight voice low. "Scared or not, they're still dangerous. Don't mistake their fear for weakness, baby. Fearful men lash out harder." Leona nodded, not because she needed the warning, but because she already knew it was true. Just then the door rattled a heavy knock, sharp and deliberate. Everyone froze. Danielle moved first, her shoulders stiff as she walked to the window and peeled back the curtain a sliver. Her breath caught. "Don't move," she whispered. "Stay here." Leona stood anyway, crossing the room slowly as Danielle opened the front door. A brick crashed through the living room window before Danielle could even reach the handle. Glass exploded inward, scattering across the hardwood floor in a glittering arc. The sound was deafening, followed by silence that felt even louder. No one screamed, no one moved, not at first. On the floor, just beside the broken glass, was a folded piece of paper taped tightly to the brick with black electrical tape. Marcus reached it first, his hands trembling as he peeled it free. The message was short. "Back off or bleed like your uncle did." Danielle pressed a hand to her chest and sat down abruptly, her face pale, her eyes wide with something deeper than shock. "Enough," she said, her voice breaking. "This has gone far enough. You are 15 years old, Leona. They are threatening your life." But Leona didn't sit. She didn't cry. She picked up the brick, turned it over in her hand like evidence at a crime scene, and set it gently on the counter. Her face was unreadable, not cold but deeply still. "They already tried to silence me," she said, her voice steady. "This just proves how desperate they are." Marcus looked at her, his mouth opening as if to argue, then closing again when he saw the look in her eyes. Danielle stood slowly, her hands still shaking. "I can't lose you too," she said, and there was something about the way she said too that made the air in the room shift. It wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about headlines. It was about Devon, about a brother who had vanished into the same system that now circled her daughter like a storm cloud with no name. "I know," Leona said softer now, "but if I stop then they win. And if they win, we lose everything. Devon, the tribunal, the truth. Everything." Danielle walked over, brushed a piece of glass from Leona's sleeve, and touched her face lightly. Her fingers lingered there, not holding her back, just holding on. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. Leona didn't promise. She couldn't. Careful hadn't worked. Only fearless would do. She walked back to her laptop, sat down, and opened the folder marked YCTA, Full Disclosure. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, attaching files, cross-checking data, embedding evidence trails. News outlets, civil rights organizations, whistleblower forums, law schools. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for backup. She just hit send. And across the country, inboxes lit up. There were no speeches, no cameras, no applause. Just raw, verified truth, every ruling, every transcript, every biased paragraph Mercer had ever written. Every email Sloan had tried to bury, every name they had tried to intimidate into silence. All of it now public, now permanent. As the files uploaded, Leona leaned back in her chair, the broken window still whistling with morning wind behind her. Her mother sat at the table, now staring at the brick, as if it were still warm. Marcus stood by the window watching the street. And in that moment they were all quiet. Not from fear, not from defeat, but from the understanding that the war wasn't coming. It had already begun. And this was their answer. The world didn't explode overnight, but something shifted quiet and deep like a fault line, finally groaning under the weight of years of silence. It started as a ripple, just a few cautious headlines scrolling across the morning news ticker, accompanied by photos that flickered too quickly to fully register. Then came the wave, national outlets picking up the story anchors, reading names and numbers with a tension that leaked between the lines, as if they too were unsure whether they were delivering history or the beginning of a reckoning. Across living rooms and breakfast tables, Americans watched clips of Judge Hollis Mercer leaving the courthouse under a swarm of flashing cameras, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat he rarely wore before. The footage played again and again. Mercer shielding his eyes, brushing past microphones, refusing to answer, shouted questions about email leaks, sentencing disparities, and unauthorized detainments of minors. Behind him, protesters had already gathered, teachers, parents, former defendants, even retired lawyers, all holding signs that seemed to speak with one voice. Justice is not a privilege. Youth voices matter. This ends now. In Atlanta, the Harper House remained quieter than usual, though not out of fear anymore. There was a kind of sacred stillness to it, like the air was waiting to see what might come next. Leona stood in front of the television, her arms folded loosely, her weight shifted slightly to one side. She wasn't watching Mercer. She was watching the people, those behind the barricades, those chanting into bullhorns, those holding handmade posters with her name scrawled in bold black letters. "That's you, you know," Marcus said from the couch, voice low and full of something between awe and disbelief. "They're marching for you." Leona shook her head, her eyes never leaving the screen. "They're marching for truth," she replied. "I just happened to be the one who cracked the door open." In the kitchen, Danielle leaned on the counter, her coffee going cold beside her. She didn't speak, but her expression said everything: exhaustion, pride, worry, and something else that had taken root more recently: respect. Not the kind handed out for good grades or clean rooms, but the kind earned through fire, through standing up and refusing to be knocked back down. Miles away in a quiet chamber high above the city, Justice Naomi Caldwell adjusted the microphone in front of her. She wore no robe. She didn't need it. The room was packed, media in the back, legal observers along the wall, colleagues seated solemnly around the curved desk where she now stood. Her voice when it came was soft but clear, like someone finally releasing something she had carried far too long. "My name is Naomi Caldwell," she began, "and today I accept responsibility for the silence I once believed was necessary." The room went still, save for the faint hum of cameras recording every breath, every blink. "There was a time when I thought that protecting my seat on this court would allow me to protect others," she continued, "that if I stayed quiet, I could do more good from within." She paused here, not for effect, but because the next words felt heavier than any she had spoken in a courtroom. "I now understand that some battles cannot be delayed without becoming betrayal." She didn't read from a script. She didn't raise her voice. But when she said the words, "I am resigning from the Supreme Court effective immediately," the air in the room seemed to change color. Some gasped, some nodded slowly. But all of them understood this wasn't surrender. It was a choice, a return, a reckoning from the inside out. Back in the Harper kitchen, Leona sat at the table with her laptop, open her inbox overflowing with subject lines. In all caps, interview requests, legal inquiries, offers of protection, documentaries, scholarships, panels, platforms. It was as if the world had been waiting for a new kind of story to believe in, and now they had found it. But she read them all with the same expression, thoughtful, distant, not uninterested, but discerning. Marcus leaned over, scrolling through with her. "That's Harvard," he said, pointing. "That one's from The Atlantic. That one's from Netflix." Leona clicked one closed, without opening it. "I know," she said softly, "but none of them are the work." Danielle walked in, drying her hands with a kitchen towel, and placed a bowl of fruit in the center of the table. "What does the work look like now?" she asked. Leona looked up, meeting her mother's eyes with calm certainty. "It looks like building something that outlives the noise," she said. "Something other kids can hold on to when no one believes them yet." Later that evening, just as the sun dipped low behind the skyline and the golden light stretched across their street in warm, slow stripes, Leona walked outside alone. The air had cooled the wind soft against her cheeks, carrying with it the distant sound of a city exhaling after a long, hard breath. Across the street stood the courthouse, tall, unmoving, its marble facade catching the last of the day's light. 6 months ago, it had looked like a fortress. Today it looked smaller, not harmless, not defeated, but no longer untouchable. Leona stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, then climbed a few of the courthouse steps and turned not to enter, but to face the horizon behind her, the rooftops, the street lamps, just flickering on the distant sound of voices down the block. And in that still gold-lit pause, she smiled not out of triumph, but out of understanding. Change didn't always arrive in thunder or declarations. Sometimes it came like this, with a quiet decision not to be quiet anymore. With a girl on a step watching the sun set over a city that, for the first time in a long time, was listening. The conference room inside the Fulton County Courthouse was dimly lit, its blinds drawn tightly against the glare of the late morning sun. The stale air smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet, with a faint metallic tang that lingered at the back of the throat. Around the long mahogany table sat Judge Hollis Mercer, District Attorney Victor Sloan, and 5 other advisors, legal assistants, political strategists, and 2 well-connected consultants whose names never appeared on official rosters. No one touched the lukewarm coffee in the chipped carafe at the center of the table. The only sound was the soft shuffling of paper and the occasional quiet tap of Sloan's wedding ring against the side of his tablet. "She's not backing down," Sloan said finally, his voice measured but edged with irritation. He tapped the screen in front of him and turned it to face Mercer. "She's gaining ground, faster than we expected." The image on the screen showed a photo of Leona Harper speaking quietly to a local reporter on a sidewalk, her posture relaxed but her eyes direct. Behind her, a few other students stood in a semicircle, holding folders, clipboards, and one hastily drawn poster that read, "Truth deserves a platform." Mercer stared at the image for a long moment, his jaw set, the tendons in his neck taut beneath his crisp collar. "We end this now," he said slowly and clearly, "before it spreads." There was a murmur of agreement around the table, uneasy, quiet, not entirely confident. No one wanted to be the first to ask what end this meant. Sloan, however, didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "We plant doubt," he said. "Make it about motives. Say she's a puppet. That her family has political ties. That the movement's being hijacked by foreign influence." And the brother Mercer asked, not looking up from the image. "He's a variable. The kind that can't stay uncontrolled. Sloane smiled, tight and professional. Already working on it. We've got someone in place. Low-level contact. Friendly face from a past he won't quite remember. He'll lean in, take a few photos, drop a few suggestions. Make it look like Marcus is connected to something problematic. Make it messy, Mercer said. Make it stick. And keep your hands clean. Across town at Carter High, Marcus Harper leaned against his locker, shoving a worn textbook into his backpack, while students moved past in waves of hallway noise, locker slams, sneaker squeaks, bursts of laughter that felt louder than usual. A voice called out behind him. "Marcus, man, it's been forever!" He turned and found himself staring at a tall guy with a well-pressed jacket and an easy smile, too easy, like a rehearsed handshake. The guy slapped Marcus on the shoulder in a way that was meant to seem casual but landed just a bit too hard. "You still ball. We're setting up a pickup game this weekend. Should come through, like old times." Marcus blinked, searching his memory for a connection, but found only vague shapes and distant summer camps. "Yeah," he said cautiously, taking a small step back. "Maybe?" He turned to leave, feeling that old tug in his gut, that instinct he'd learned to trust when something felt off, but not obvious. As he walked away, he heard the quiet snap of a photo being taken behind him. That evening, tension settled over the Harper home like a weight draped across the roof, pressing into the walls and down through the floors. Danielle moved through the kitchen with a distracted energy, her movements sharp and quick, the clatter of dishes, the snap of a cupboard door, the rush of running water turned off too abruptly. "This has to stop," she said, her voice low but clear. Leona sat at the table, her laptop open, a spreadsheet of court documents stretched across the screen like a battlefield. "I can't stop," she replied without looking up. "You know that." Danielle turned sharply, the sound of her hand hitting the countertop echoing louder than intended. "They're following your brother now," she said. "They're painting us as criminals. You think they'll stop if you keep pushing? One the bow by 10 compristed by tum-tum time." Leona closed the laptop gently, the sound soft but final. She looked at her mother not with defiance but with quiet resolve. "If we don't fight back, they win. They always win." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You're a child," Danielle said, her voice cracking. "You don't understand what this costs. You think the law will protect you." Her breath caught. "It didn't protect Devon. It didn't protect me. It won't protect you." Silence fell heavy and raw. Marcus shifted in his seat beside the window, torn between wanting to protect his sister and needing to honor her clarity. Leona's hands curled into fists on the table. "I know the risks," she said. "I know it better than anyone." Danielle shook her head slowly, tears rising in her eyes. "I already lost one brother to this fight," she whispered. "I can't lose my daughter too." The memory hung in the air like smoke. Devon's face, Devon's laugh, Devon's name written in ink on a case file they were never allowed to read. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Leona stood her shoulders, square, her face pale but steady. "I'm not doing this because I'm brave," she said. "I'm doing this because someone has to." She turned and walked down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps receding like the closing of a chapter no one wanted to end. Danielle sat down at the table, covering her face with her hands, her body shuddering with the weight of love and fear colliding in her chest. Marcus remained at the window, staring at the dark street outside, watching shadows move beneath the street lamp. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing leaves across the lawn in slow spirals. And inside the house, a war had begun, not just against the system that had failed them, but against the fear that had lived too long in the walls. It was no longer a question of whether they were in danger. The question now was how far they were willing to go for the truth. And the answer for Leona, at least, had already been given quietly, completely, and without apology. The town didn't know it was on trial until the evidence started showing up in places they couldn't ignore: on bulletin boards in the city hall lobby, on the local morning news, between weather and traffic, on social media feeds, shared by teachers and church deacons and grocery clerks alike. It began with the name Judge Hollis Mercer, and then another, and then another. Not just his name, but the names of the children he sentenced, the cases he presided over, the disparities too consistent to explain away. It wasn't rage that carried the movement forward, it was precision, cold, calm, and undeniable. The livestream had cracked the wall, but what came after was quieter, and in many ways more powerful: the methodical unfolding of truth in full daylight. Leona and her team didn't shout, they printed, they cited. They posted full transcripts with sections highlighted patterns, mapped statistics made human through the stories of kids who had been buried by the system before anyone ever learned their names. The town's weekly paper, the same one that used to run headlines like "Local Judge to Receive Honorary Degree," published a front-page story under a very different title. "A Pattern of Punishment New Data Suggests Systemic Bias in Juvenile Court." Beneath it was a collage of black and white school photos, faces of black and brown youth whose records told a story of over-sentencing, coercive pleas, and silenced objections. The article didn't editorialize. It didn't need to. The facts spoke louder than any opinion could. At the same time, the Youth Tribunal uploaded a public database, simple in design, exhaustive in content. Anyone could search it. Parents, teachers, journalists, even other judges. Case numbers, charges, outcomes, racial demographics, attorney notes. A timeline overlay showed the evolution of Mercer's career mapped against controversial rulings and campaign donations from private prison lobbies. It wasn't conspiracy. It was math, code, court records, and motive laid bare. At first, the local officials scrambled to dismiss it. Out of context, one councilman said on air, "A coordinated smear campaign," echoed another. But within days, public hearings began. Parents came forward, often for the first time, sharing how their children had been pressured into pleading guilty just to avoid longer sentences. A retired court clerk stood up at one forum, her hands trembling, and said, "I filed those papers. I always wondered why the black kids never seemed to come out with probation. I stopped wondering. I started praying." Then came the voices of those who had once sat in those courtrooms as defendants, now older, now bold enough to speak. One young man, mid-20s, in work boots and a frayed uniform, stood at a community meeting and said, "I got 6 months for stealing a phone when I was 16. White kid I knew, same age, same charge, walked out with a warning. I'm not bitter, but I remember every second of that 6 months. And I remember the look on that judge's face when he gave it to me like he was doing me a favor." The town shifted in degrees, resistance, hesitation, then something like awakening. A local pastor used his Sunday sermon to read aloud from the database, pausing after each name, letting the silence after each sentence sink deep. "This isn't about one judge," he said. "This is about what we let him become." Outside the church that afternoon, someone taped a sign to a lamppost that read, "Justice isn't real until it's equal." The wind flapped it gently like a flag. In homes across the county, people sat at kitchen tables, poring over documents on tablets and phones, pointing to columns, and asking each other, "How did we not see this? How long has this been happening?" And always eventually someone whispered, "What do we do now?" Back in Leona's makeshift headquarters, a room in the back of the community center with 2 folding tables and a dozen laptops, the team moved like a small army. Emails poured in faster than they could answer them. Law students offered support. Former clerks submitted anonymous affidavits. A professor at a nearby university sent a proposal. "Would you consider publishing this as a case study in judicial ethics?" Maya, reading over the message, laughed softly. "First they ignore you, then they ask you to write textbooks." But Leona wasn't celebrating. She stood by the whiteboard, reviewing the case timeline, her fingers brushing lightly against the names she'd written in dry erase marker, eyes moving slowly as if rereading a prayer. Marcus stepped beside her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, but her jaw was tight. "This isn't the hard part," she said. "The hard part is making sure they don't forget in 6 months. Or 6 years. She stepped back and surveyed the board lines, arrows, names, dates, and then wiped her hand across it, erasing everything but one line she rewrote in darker ink. "What does justice look like when no one's watching?" Outside the community center, a group of teenagers gathered, some from the original team, others new to the fight. They handed out printouts, answered questions, helped neighbors understand how to navigate the digital archive. They weren't just data collectors anymore. They were translators of law, of history, of buried truth now unearthed and ready to be seen. And in that moment, under a soft gray sky in a town that had once let too much slide by, unnoticed, the quiet noise of civic awakening continued. No protests, no speeches. Just people stepping forward one by one, choosing not to look away. Inside, Leona sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and stared at the homepage of the tribunal one more time. There at the top, above the charts and articles and audio files, were 5 words that hadn't changed since the first upload: truth before power. Always forward. She closed her eyes for a second, not to rest but to remember. Then she opened a new tab and began writing again. Because truth doesn't stay still. It moves, and now it had momentum. The living room of the Harper house no longer resembled a place for rest, but a war room lined with hope, grief, and an unwavering sense of duty. Stacks of papers spilled across the dining table and onto the floor. Case summaries, internal emails, annotated legal briefs, while laptops sat open and humming, their screens aglow with spreadsheets and timelines that traced a decade of systemic failure. The curtains remained half-drawn, letting in just enough sunlight to keep the space grounded in the present, but not so much as to forget the battles still unfolding beyond the walls. Leona sat in the center of it all, her posture upright, her shoulders squared, her eyes moving between documents and screens with a focus that had become second nature. She wore a navy hoodie and jeans, her hair pulled back in a low bun, not because she had to go anywhere, but because there was something about routine that gave her momentum. She didn't need caffeine anymore. Adrenaline, purpose, and an expanding sense of responsibility had become her fuel. Danielle stood nearby, folding laundry more out of nervous energy than necessity, occasionally glancing toward the door whenever a car passed or a siren sounded in the distance. Marcus leaned against the windowsill, scrolling through a long thread of messages from allies, supporters, and a few too many reporters looking for exclusive angles. Outside the street looked quiet, idyllic even, but inside the tension was palpable, like the moment before a storm when the air seems to hum against your skin. "We need to coordinate with the legal support team," Leona said, not looking up from the keyboard. "We've got at least 20 follow-ups coming from yesterday's release, and a civil rights group from Chicago wants access to the full dataset." Marcus nodded, thumbing out a quick response. "I'll loop them in, but you should take a break, Leo. Even generals sleep." She smiled faintly at the remark but didn't stop typing. "Maybe after the town hall," she murmured, "or after the review board, or after they actually arrest someone who matters." Danielle placed a folded sweatshirt on the back of a chair and spoke without turning around. "Baby, they already arrested someone who matters. They just didn't know who you were yet." Leona paused for a moment, fingers hovering above the keys, her jaw tightening slightly at her mother's words. There was truth there, layered and complicated. Being seen had never been the goal, but it had become the consequence. And with it came the pressure of representation, of carrying not only her own voice, but the voices of so many others who didn't get the chance or didn't survive the silence long enough to speak. Across the room, a tablet dinged, signaling a message from one of their remote team members. Zara had uploaded another transcript, an old juvenile case from 2013. One Leona had flagged weeks ago for its odd sentencing language. She clicked it open and scanned quickly. Same pattern, same judge. Same coded words meant to imply threat without stating it. Volatile demeanor, emotional instability, lacked remorse. Phrases used as camouflage for bias dressed up in professionalism to disguise the punishment of vulnerability. "They're starting to feel it," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "One of Mercer's former law clerks emailed this morning, said they're reviewing his old case files. Quietly, internally." Leona nodded once, then leaned back in her chair. "That's how it always begins. First they review, then they retract, then they pretend they never backed him to begin with." Danielle sat down at the edge of the couch, her gaze steady, her voice soft. "You sure you're ready for what happens next?" Leona looked at her mother, not with defiance, but with a kind of clarity that came from having crossed a line she could never return from. "No," she said, "but I know what happens if we stop now. And I'd rather be exhausted than complicit." The room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not fear, not fatigue, just space. Space to breathe, to carry the weight, to remember why they were doing any of this at all. The television was off, but news tickers still ran in their heads, looping headlines about misconduct investigations, resignations, community protests. And while it all felt like movement, Leona knew that momentum could only be kept alive if someone stayed behind to push. She stood and stretched her muscles stiff from sitting too long, her feet bare against the hardwood floor. Then she walked to the front window and pulled the curtain back slightly, letting the last light of the afternoon spill in. Across the street, a few neighbors were gathering near the park, some holding signs, some just standing close together, nodding as if they'd been waiting for this moment their entire lives. One of them, an older man with a cane and a deep navy cap, held up a piece of cardboard that simply read, "We see you, Leona. Keep going. She stepped away from the window, her face unreadable for a beat, then turned back toward the table and picked up a legal pad, flipping to a clean page. We need a new focus, she said. Something beyond Mercer. The system that let him thrive, it's bigger, deeper, hidden in policy funding language. Marcus looked up. You want to go after the roots? Leona nodded. Not just him. All of it. The school-to-prison pipeline, the judges who whisper bias in plain English, the contracts with private detention centers nobody talks about. Danielle closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a breath that sounded like surrender and support at once. Then we start with the ones who sign the checks, she said. Because power doesn't just show up in a robe. Sometimes it's behind a desk. The room shifted again, no longer a house, but a movement in miniature. Plans scribbled on the margins of homework, courage packed between meals, history written at a kitchen table where one girl had refused to be quiet and the world had finally begun to listen. And as the sun disappeared fully behind the trees, casting long shadows over the papers and the screens, Leona wrote the first words at the top of a new page. Not a headline, not a slogan, just a question, one that would guide everything that came next. What does justice look like after the verdict? 6 months later, the walls of the old community center on Auburn Avenue echoed with the low hum of voices, folding chairs, scraping against scuffed linoleum floors, and the quiet shuffling of pages being turned with nervous fingers. Outside, the city moved at its usual rhythm, cars easing through stop signs, the distant wail of a siren disappearing into the east. But inside that modest room, something quieter and more powerful was taking root. A banner hung from the front wall, hand-painted in bold navy letters that read, Youth Legal Academy Founder Session. Below it, a projector flickered to life, its light casting a pale glow across the room, filled with teenagers, teachers, and a few tired but hopeful parents sitting near the back. Leona stood at the front of the room in a blazer, one size too big. Her sleeves slightly cuffed, a pen tucked behind her ear like she'd just walked out of a strategy meeting. Her voice, when it came, was steady, carrying just enough volume to reach the corners of the room without needing to be raised. You're not here to memorize laws, she said, her eyes sweeping the group slowly. You're here to understand them, to know how they work, to know how to use them to protect yourselves and each other. The students sat in silence, leaning forward slightly in their seats, not out of habit but out of instinct, drawn in by the clarity of her tone. They were a mix of ages, backgrounds, accents. Some wore school uniforms, others had on hoodies and jeans. A few clutched notebooks so tightly the edges had curled. There was something electric in the air, not dramatic, not loud, but present, like the way silence settles just before rain begins. Behind Leona, Marcus worked the laptop that controlled the slides, his face partially lit by the screen, tapping through photos of civil rights cases, handwritten notes from the tribunal archive, and pages from actual court transcripts the students would study in the weeks ahead. In the back of the room, Danielle leaned against the wall with her arms crossed, watching her daughter, not as a child anymore, but as a force. Her eyes were full of pride, and something more tender, like the slow ache that comes from letting go while holding on at the same time. Leona walked slowly between the rows of chairs, her shoes clicking softly on the tile, pausing now and then to glance at the students' faces. You might be the only one in a room who knows what's wrong when it happens, she said. And sometimes that means speaking up when it would be easier to sit down. But knowing the law means you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to be clear. A student in the second row raised her hand, hesitant at first. What if the judge doesn't care, she asked. Like, what if they look right at you and still say no? Leona paused the corners of her mouth, turning slightly upward. Not a full smile, but something close to recognition. Then you remember everything she said. You remember their words. You write it down. You tell someone. And if that doesn't work, you find 10 others who know how to speak the same truth. Because when one voice doesn't work, a chorus is harder to ignore. The projector dimmed and the students were handed their materials, a slim packet that looked more like a zine than a textbook full of annotated diagrams, quotes from constitutional cases, and pages left blank with instructions to fill with the laws you wish existed. It wasn't polished, but it was alive, crafted with intention and built to grow with them. A few students exchanged glances, flipping through the pages. One boy murmured under his breath, "This ain't school. This is something else." Leona heard him and nodded without turning. "It's not school," she said. "It's survival in advance." As the session continued, students paired off reading real case files out loud, identifying procedural errors and violations in judgment. Some struggled through the legal language, others caught details no one else noticed. They weren't being trained to recite, they were being trained to think, to observe, to question. Marcus moved between the tables, offering tips on how to track paper trails or recognize bias hidden in neutral phrases. Leona sat beside a girl working through a case of unlawful search, her finger tracing the timeline as she whispered, "They never said she could leave." "That's coercion, right?" Leona nodded. "That's exactly what it is." By the time the final hour arrived, the room had shifted. The students weren't just watching anymore, they were participating, challenging, explaining, interrupting each other with, "Wait, that's not what due process means," or "Hold on, I think I found something." The transformation wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, steady, real. The kind of change that sinks in, slow, but stays. As the session-wrapped chairs were folded packets tucked into backpacks and thank yous whispered on the way to the door. Outside, the sky had turned soft orange, the last light slipping over the city's low rooftops, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Leona stood by the door, saying goodbye to each student, answering last-minute questions, promising there would be more sessions, more space, more chances to keep learning. One boy, maybe 13, paused before stepping out and said, "My cousin was locked up for something he didn't even do. He told me no one believed him. I'm gonna send him this stuff." Leona placed a hand on his shoulder gently. "Tell him we do." After everyone had left and the light had faded fully into evening, Leona walked outside alone. The breeze was light, brushing strands of hair against her cheek, the air cool but not cold. Across the street, the courthouse stood tall, and still, its stone pillars bathed in gold from the streetlights, its windows reflecting only the quiet of the night. 6 months ago, that building had looked impenetrable, untouchable, invincible. Now it looked smaller. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She climbed the first few steps, not to go inside, but to look out. Over the rooftops, over the old streets, over the city that had learned her name, not because she asked it to, but because she refused to let it forget itself. In that moment, she wasn't the girl who had been tased or slapped or silenced. She was the girl who had stayed, who had turned pain into purpose, who had asked what now and then built the answer with her own hands. She closed her eyes for just a second, letting the stillness press against her skin like the first moment after a long storm. And when she opened them again, the city was still there, flawed, restless, unfinished, but listening. Finally listening. Sometimes the loudest kind of courage is the quiet kind, the kind that shows up in courtrooms, in classrooms, or at a kitchen table, and simply refuses to stay silent. What Leona's story reminds us is that justice isn't just a word carved above a courthouse door, it's a responsibility we all share, no matter our age. For older generations watching this, it's a call to remember the fights we thought were over still need our voices. Maybe we don't march like we used to, but we can still teach, still guide, still protect the young people daring to speak up. Truth doesn't belong to any one era. It lives in those who are willing to carry it forward, especially when it's hard. So if you've ever felt like your time to make a difference has passed, think again. Because the world still needs your wisdom, your presence, and your story. And someone like Leona, she becomes even braver when she knows she's not standing alone. If this story moved you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter, stories that lift voices, build bridges, and keep the truth alive.